As we begin this presentation, we would like to express our deepest gratitude to America Media for making this event possible. I will begin by reading the biographies of all three of our speakers, and then you will hear from each of them. Timothy Michael Dolan was named Archbishop of New York by Pope Benedict XVI on February 23, 2009. He was installed as Archbishop of New York on April 15, 2009. He had served as Archbishop of Milwaukee since he was named by Pope John Paul II on June 25, 2002. Archbishop Dolan was ordained to the priesthood on June 19, 1976. In 1979, he began studies for a doctorate in American Church history at the Catholic University of America. In 1994, he was appointed rector of the Pontifical North American College in Rome, where he served until June 2001. The work of the Archbishop in the area of seminary education has influenced the life and ministry of a great number of priests of the new millennium. He is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of the Catholic University of America. He is also a member of the Pontifical Council for Promoting New Evangelization. Father Matt Malone, S.J., is the President and Editor-in-Chief of America Media. Father Malone began his tenure on October 1, 2012. At the time of his appointment, he was the youngest editor-in-chief in the history of America magazine.
Wow.
From 1997 to 2002, he served as the founding deputy director of Mass Inc., an independent political think tank, and co-publisher of Commonwealth, its award-winning review of politics, ideas, and civic life. Father Malone entered the Society of Jesus in 2002. He was ordained a priest on June 9, 2012. He received his undergraduate degree cum laude from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He holds a MA from Fordham University, a Bachelor of Divinity from the University of London, and a baccalaureate in sacred theology from the Catholic University of Louvain. Claire Volk was a student at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas. She is in her fourth and final year of pursuing degrees in English literature and education. She helped research and create the exhibit American Dream, A Journey with American Saints, and traveled to Italy this summer with a group of students on pilgrimage to Rome and to present the exhibit at the meeting in Rimini.
Beautiful.
Please welcome Cardinal Dolan. You can go up first.
Am I going first? Thank you, everybody. I am so happy to be here, although I'm less than comfortable being to the left of a Jesuit. Oh. Now, I got to go quick because I only got 15 minutes, and I'm going to try to make 4 points. You ready? Point number 1, thank you, Comunione e Liberazione. I look forward annually to be with you. This has become I think this is the 4th time I've had the honor of being with you, and I really enjoy it. And I thank you. I'm aware of your light and salt that you are to the world, and especially here in the Archdiocese of New York. You know how refreshing it is. Usually when I'm speaking at a place, lined up outside are a lot of walkers, all right? Because I speak to older audiences. To see 100 baby carriages out there is extraordinarily refreshing, okay? So there's point number 1, not bad, right? Point number 2, what a magnificent topic to speak about saints. You know, Fulton J. Sheen, who I hope is a saint one day, who's buried at St. Patrick's Cathedral, said, "The church is in the business of making saints. The church is at her best when she makes saints." St. Paul used to refer to the first Christians as the saints, reminding us that that's the vocation that we all have. One of the central teachings, as you know, of the Second Vatican Council was what's called the universal call to holiness, that sanctity is the vocation of all of us. There was a gentleman back in St. Louis where I was a parish priest. He was in his 90s in my first parish, a remarkable man, a great apostle. And he was, but in his 90s, he was in fragile health, and it used to be my joy to bring him Holy Communion on Fridays. And if I'd call to make sure the time was right and all, sometimes if he wasn't there, his answering machine would say, "This is Linus, a sinner trying to become a saint." And that's not bad, is it? That's somewhat the vocation of all of us. So there's number two. Number three, I'm supposed to speak about my favorite saint. Now, when I was asked that, the first saints that came to mind, I was told somebody else had taken. But I'm just glad they're being covered. So it was kind of tough, everybody, because I have a lot of them. But the one I've chosen is St. Damien the Leper. I first heard about St. Damien the Leper when I was a boy in second grade. The story so moved me then when it was taught me by my second grade teacher, Sister Mary Bosco. Let me just for a minute or two outline his life and then go on for a couple more minutes about why I find him so spiritually invigorating. Joseph de Verster was his family name was de Verster, born in 1840 in Flanders in Belgium. His baptismal name was Joseph. And he was attracted at the age of 18 to a vocation to the religious life. And he joined a rather young order at the time, the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary. And he was ordained a priest for them in 1824. That order was given by the Pope at the time the particular evangelical mandate to evangelize Polynesia, the islands of the Pacific. And his brother, who was also in the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary, had been sent to Hawaii before him and had gotten very sick and had to be sent home. So Damien, that was his name in religion, Damien asked to take his brother's place. And he was sent to Hawaii and was extraordinarily happy when he went there in 1864, the very age of his ordination. In 1873, so 9 years after he was ordained, 9 years after he had arrived in Hawaii, he was sent to the infamous, which he made famous, the infamous and frightening colony on Molokai for lepers. Now, I know there are some medical personnel in this distinguished group, so I don't need to go into the graphics of leprosy, but we as Christians know that the name itself, because of our familiarity with the gospel, shows the hideous nature of the disease. It was extraordinarily painful. It literally ate up a person's body, and it was highly contagious. So to go there in itself was an act of bravery. And when Father Damien went to Kalapapa, is actually what they call it on the island of Molokai. The island of Molokai is bigger than the leper colony at Kalapapa. I knew that because 2 years ago, right about now, I had the honor of visiting there. He found it the dreaded place that notoriety had explained it to be. The people were in hideous condition. Their human dignity had been eradicated. The physical suffering was incredible. The medical care was next to nothing, and the living conditions were awful. It's very interesting, so Father is going to be there till 1889 when he dies. Father Damien, when he would die at the age of 49. And Father Damien, very interesting, my panelists might comment on this later, he said about his first task was to restore human dignity. And so he just loved the people, and he taught them skills. He taught them some farming. He taught them to build better houses. And he restored a sense of human dignity and tried his best to teach the sacredness of human life. Of course, his main goal was to take care of their spiritual needs, and that he did to a heroic degree. In 1884, he himself contracted leprosy, and he would die 5 years later on the Tuesday of Holy Week in 1889. Now, that's just the sketch of his life, my brothers and sisters, but can I share with you a couple minutes why I find him so spiritually uplifting? First of all, there was nothing mystical or dramatically holy about Father Damien. And perhaps I like that because there's nothing mystical or dramatically holy about me. He just took his Christian vocation and his priestly vocation very seriously. He worked hard. He loved his people. He tried his best to pray and to celebrate the sacraments. He was just a plodding, P-L-O-D-D-I-N-G, not plotting, plodding parish priest doing his best to tend to the people that he loved. He didn't have any stigmata. He would in a spiritual sense when he contracted leprosy. He didn't have the ability to read hearts or to tell prophecies or to speak in tongues or to levitate or to bilocate like some of the saints do. Nothing dramatically mystical or miraculous about him. The second reason I like him is because way back then, he personified what our beloved Holy Father often speaks about now. Did he ever have the smell of the sheep? At a time when people didn't even want to be in the same airspace with lepers, he would embrace them, he would cleanse them, he would eat with them, he would hear their confessions, he would bury them, he would tend to them when they were sick. And simply put, everybody, he was so close to them that he contracted the disease. You know the story that one day he was in the rocking chair saying his office, as every priest does, and the woman with, we call it now Hansen's disease, which is the preferred title, the woman with Hansen's disease who took care of the house was bringing him his tea, and as she got close to him, she tripped, and the scalding water fell on his ankles and feet. She screamed, he said nothing, and it dawned on him that he had no feeling in his feet, which was the first indication of the dreaded disease. It so ravaged his body that he couldn't bear the weight of his priestly cassock, which explains his renowned statue in the U.S. Capitol, where his cassock is square because they put this balsam light wood to frame his body, and he wore his cassock and vestments over that because it couldn't stand, his body was so racked with pain that he couldn't stand the pressure of the vestments at Mass. You talk about the smell of the sheep. This was a man that was so close that he contracted the disease. Reminds me of the book of Hebrews, the readings that we have this week in our Liturgy of the Word about Jesus, who knew our sorrows and took them upon himself because he became one of us. It's a beautiful story that the first time after he had discovered that he had the leprosy, he used to begin his sermons on Sunday by saying, "My dear lepers." And this time he said, "My brother and sister lepers," because he had the disease. Here's point number 3. Maybe worse than the human suffering, if that be possible, would be his human suffering. He was scorned by his own religious ardor. They didn't understand him. They didn't like him. They thought he was a little too adamant in asking for greater care and respect and supplies and more personnel to tend to his beloved lepers. The world heard rumors that he had contracted the disease because of sexual immorality, which was completely scurrilous. At the time, it was believed that that's the way the disease was spread, which, by the way, everybody, meant that in the 1980s, in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, then blessed Damien the leper became a patron of those suffering that dreaded disease when they were maligned, and when it was concluded that they deserved what they got because of their sexual promiscuity. No less a personage than Robert Louis Stevenson, the acclaimed novelist, defended Father Damien worldwide, but he had to suffer that. He never spoke about his physical suffering. He did speak about his loneliness. He did speak about the discouragement and the interior struggles that he had. He did speak about the pain of misunderstanding. He did speak about missing such things as, get this is how human he was: tobacco for his pipe, good tea, and books. And you know what he found most unbearable? Listen to this, and this moved me very much. He used to describe that the greatest suffering he bore was the inability to go to confession. Now think about it. No other priest would come. And when the boats would come to the dock and all the lepers would run down, and when they would just push off the lepers, eager to get rid of them, Father Damien would stand on the dock and yell up to the boat, "Is there a priest on board who could hear my confession?" It rarely happened. Every once in a while there would be a priest who would come, but the priest was afraid to get off the boat. And Father Damien would yell out his sins in Latin to his brother priest to receive absolution. That moved me when I first heard it, and that moved me now. I hope in a way I've been able to tell you a little bit more about one of my favorite saints, St. Damien the Leper, and to explain why I love him so much. Now, I got 1 point left, and how much time do I have, Claire? Do I have a couple of minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. Can I just share with you a little bit about another saint? And I don't use this word frivolously. I couldn't talk about him because he's not canonized. Many of you in New York will recognize him. We just had his funeral yesterday at St. Patrick's Cathedral, and that's Detective Stephen McDonald. Have you heard about Stephen McDonald? 29 years old. You see the pictures, big and strapping. He's what half of the audience would call a hunk. He was that handsome. Proud policeman, fourth generation, Irish Catholic, and he's shot in the back 3 times in Central Park by a 15-year-old boy. He was in Bellevue Hospital for 9 months recovering, and it quickly became evident he was completely paralyzed from the neck down. He couldn't move anything. He couldn't breathe on his own, and at the beginning, he couldn't even speak. Through a lot of work and a lot of therapy, he regained his voice, and one of the first things he did was, as 3 bullets almost took his life and killed him, 3 words made him famous, because the first 3 words he said were to his assailant, "I forgive you." And he embarked upon a career of reconciliation and peace. There wasn't the bedside of a wounded policeman where you would not find him in his wheelchair. There was not the home of a grieving family that had lost a son, a husband, a wife, or a daughter in the line of duty where Detective McDonald could not be found consoling them. There's probably not been a school in this archdiocese where he hasn't visited. There's not a prison in this state where he's not invited to speak about reconciliation and forgiveness. And he became a renowned figure in this New York community. He testified at the parole hearing for his assailant on his behalf. And when the parole board said, "It's difficult for us to release you because you tell us you have nowhere to live when you leave prison," Detective McDonald said, "He can live with me and my family." He didn't. But what a heroic statement. At the root of all of it, everybody, of this courageous person, was by his own testimony, a deep and fervent Catholic faith. He was a man of prayer. He was a man of the Eucharist. He loved priests and sisters. He was a member of many apostolates. You would see him at every fundraising event in this archdiocese. he was a very proud and committed Catholic, and his faith only got deeper the longer he survived. So much so, he used to, in the middle of the night when he couldn't sleep, which was often, call the parish priest and say, "Father, would you go over and open church, because I want to come and sit in church." And after 3 of those visits, the parish priest said, "Stephen, here's the keys. Quit waking me up in the middle of the night." That's the kind of man, and I tell this story not only because this entire community is celebrating his life and legacy, but because it teaches us that saints are for now, that saints are not relics of the past or museum pieces. Saints are for now. Father Damien taught the world that the century before last. Stephen McDonald taught us that now, and thanks for giving me a listen to the story. Thanks a lot.
My brothers and sisters, it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And America Magazine is really pleased to be a co-sponsor of this wonderful event. It is so great and such a grace to see so many faith-filled and joyful faces in the heart of Manhattan. That's my takeaway already from this event. And it is also a great pleasure to be with you to talk about the saints and sainthood. And my family and friends would be the first to tell you that I am no expert in this subject. So my reflections may resemble something like stammering in the fog, but as Eugene O'Neill once said, stammering is the native eloquence of us fog people. And the saints, as you surely know, are really little more and need not be anything more than a love story. It's a true love story, the true love story. Chapters in the narrative that is existence itself. Men and women whose deep and living love of their Creator is so powerful that it opens their hearts to all of creation. And there are more saints, of course, than the relatively few that the Church have singled out for their piety, their compassion, their brilliance, their humility. All of Christian history is a tale told by holy men and women, imbued by the gospel message, who sought not to be more than the signs of their times, who sought to be more than the signs of their times would obviously permit. And this is often described as a kind of holy boldness. Yet what history tells us, and what God has revealed, is that saintliness is not a nearly unattainable goal, but rather the slow, patient grace of God, fully realized in a human and therefore often broken heart. And I want to reflect on the journey to holiness that is sainthood by contemplating the lives and the trials and the triumphs of 3 saints, 3 Jesuit saints, who are counted among the North American martyrs: Isaac Jogues, Jean de Brebeuf, and Charles Garnier. I should note, first of all, that I first read about these men when I was myself sent to the missions in Guyana in South America. And I had only one book with me, the Bible. And the Jesuit who was with me said, "You probably shouldn't read the Bible too closely while you are lying in your hammock, because it'll actually draw your mind to heaven, and you'll miss the rats that are running around your feet." So he found me another book, which was William Bangert's History of the Society of Jesus. I don't recommend that you read that, because it's a little like eating dry toast on the beach. But there I first encountered the stories of these men. And I should note also that America Magazine has a particular devotion to these North American martyrs, because our founding editor-in-chief, Father John Wynne, championed the cause that led to their being canonized. And these three Jesuits, whose lives are talked about in the exhibit hall, they fully represent the ideas of service and of martyrdom and of missionary fervor, of pilgrimage, what Jesuits call the magis, the call to seek the greater glory of God. And these 17th century Frenchmen are unique in just how effectively they represent individuals of extraordinary fortitude and capability who surrendered all for the salvation of souls, including that all that was their earthly prizes. For Garnier's father was secretary to King Henry III of France, and de Brebeuf was the leading linguistic scholar of his era, and Jogues was considered foremost among the literati of France. And yet each willingly surrendered his station in French society to come to a land that few had been to preach amongst a people even fewer had encountered, to minister in a place in which their own safety was anything but guaranteed. To commit oneself so fully in the midst of this uncertainty is a saintly act, and indeed a reminder to us all that certainty, rather than doubt, is the opposite of faith. From its earliest days, the Society of Jesus was filled with this missionary zeal. In the Constitutions, St. Ignatius wrote, "For the greater humility of our society and toward the complete self-mortification of each one, and in order to aid the abnegation of our own wills to the greatest extent, let us, one, besides that common obligation, be devoted to this special vow, the special vow of serving the Holy Father and the Church in our missions." That is a high bar that St. Ignatius set for the Jesuits. And these few Jesuits surpassed it. Not through their own devices, mind you, but because God gave them the grace to do so. And this reminds us that sainthood is something that God does more than something we achieve. It is not an honor attached to our lives, but the object of life itself. Not the sum of our doings, but the complete realization of our human being. And since 1540, the Society of Jesus has often been among the first to enter into new lands and to learn about and to record new cultures and to seek the salvation of souls. And this is the spirit that these three Jesuit martyrs presented in this exhibit came to this new world with. St. Isaac Jogues, probably the most famous among them, was born in 1607 in Orleans, France. He was the fifth child of a wealthy family and educated in Jesuit schools, starting at the age of 10. He entered the Society of Jesus at the age of 17 and immediately came under the influence of Louis Lallemand, a Jesuit missionary with a significant network in what was then New France. And Jogues was constantly coming into contact in his formation with this first wave of French Jesuit missionaries. He had proved adept in French literature and poetry, not common characteristics among missionaries, yet he retained this ardent zeal for missionary work. And just as Jogues was ordained in 1636, Jean de Brebeuf was returning from New France. A Jesuit since 1617 and a missionary, Brebeuf was a noted linguist who transliterated, recorded, and taught the Huron language to French Jesuits in formation. And his decade of work had borne much fruit with regard to the ministry among the Hurons. And already you can see how the zeal and the holiness of one interacts with the other and inspires their own quest and their own call. It was the work of individuals like de Brebeuf that not only inspired Jogues, but others, like Charles Garnier, the son of a prosperous family, who arrived in New France the same year as Jogues in 1636. And his inspiration was the same, the salvation of souls. His fervor was quieter than either that of Jogues or Brebeuf, and contemporaries considered Garnier the lamb to Brebeuf's lion. He preferred to enter into the lives and traditions of the Native Americans in an unassuming manner, learning from them, and adapting the traditions of the Native Americans to his task. And this reminds us that our evangelization is always as a community, that we are simply, as individuals, parts of the one body of Christ, that we need one another and the talents and the toils of all. And their missionary experiences inevitably intertwined. The time of Isaac Jogues and the missions was a combination of the experiences and approaches of Garnier and Brebeuf. Upon arriving in Quebec, Jogues was assigned to work with de Brebeuf at the mission of St. Joseph. Garnier arrived at roughly the same time and was sent off immediately to work with the Hurons in a far-off mission. And he never saw France again. After several years in the missions, Jogues was sent to build Fort Sainte-Marie, and on his way, he and his entourage were tortured and maimed and malnourished and mocked, losing several fingers, an ear, having his feet severely damaged by rot, and encountering devastating stomach pains. René Goupil, a companion of Jogues, was killed during this same ordeal. While Jogues was eventually ransomed by the Dutch and gained passage on a ship to France from New Amsterdam, and he returned to France, where Pope Urban VIII referred to Jogues as a living martyr, granting him the dispensation to say Mass, since he was missing the digits that the canon law required him to have. In just a year and a half, though, Jogues was back in Quebec, seeking to minister amongst the only congregation he had ever known. He was captured along with Jean de Lalonde by the Mohawk Indians, and being seen as a threat and being blamed for the presence of disease, he was later martyred, and Lalonde met the same fate. It would be several years before Garnier and Brebeuf met similar fates, but they would. The death of Garnier occurred at the village of Petun in 1646, when the Iroquois attacked the Huron forces. And each man suffered, some more than others, despite all the glories and honors that awaited them in France, for the greater glory of God in this place. History is, of course, punctuated by people who die for and with and because of their faith. Even today, we see tens to hundreds of thousands of Christians being persecuted throughout the world. The 20th century alone calls to mind such heroic figures as Maximilian Kolbe, Alfred Delp, and Edith Stein, the martyrs of El Salvador, Maria Goretti, the martyr saints of China. Our saints and our martyrs remind us that the fight for salvation, the fight for the soul, is in this time as long as there is time. It's the saints in our own backyard, such as the Jesuit martyrs of North America, who tend to strike the greatest resonance with us, though. These martyrs suffered and died to bring a gift to a new land. And I think that that is an important thing to remember. For much has been said and will continue to be said about the encounter that the Jesuits and other missionaries had with what was then known as the New World. And much criticism has been leveled against those who followed the flags of the imperial powers to bring the gospel. And much of that criticism is warranted. But in the end, we can only understand their acts in their totality, only understand them as acts of faith, if we understand them as they understood them, as a gift, that they were bringing a gift to others that they had received in turn. And that is important for our own time, because it invites us to remember that we are called, as Pope Francis says, not to confrontation, but to encounter. That what is credible is not the power of our ideas, but the joy that is in our hearts. That what we have received is a gift, and what we are invited to share is a gift. Precious, and always calling us forward in a spirit of humility. We are also reminded, I think, by these stories of saintliness about something else that is helpful to our contemporary times. And that is that the goal of Christian discipleship is not to win an argument. It is to attain heaven. The goal is not to be right, but to be holy. On that same trip to South America, I encountered a modern-day Jesuit who embodied the spirit of these men. His name was Peter Britt Compton, and he had been in the missions in Central America and Guyana as long as the mission, practically as long as the mission had existed. He was born in England, the son of the aristocracy, and he had left in the late 1940s on a ship from Southampton to reach South America. He said as he was on the ship and he could see his parents on the dock as he was pulling away, he never felt more afraid or lonely in his life. For almost the next 50 years, he labored in the interior of South America, in Guyana, among the Native American people. And when I had finally reached him in a village called Carazapai, I asked him if he had ever been home again. And he said, I am home. I am home. This is home. And 2 years later, when his superior provincial flew to the capital of Guyana and got on a prop plane and flew into the interior and then got on a boat to reach Carazapai to find Father Compton in his hammock in his banab, he said, I just came to see you and to see whether there was anything you needed. And Father Compton said, I only need one thing, and that is to die among my people, among the people that I love and who have loved me into being. That is the spirit of the North American martyrs. That is the spirit of St. Ignatius, alive in our time. I'll just end this afternoon with that ancient prayer of the Church that comes to mind whenever we discuss the saints and our own quest for holiness. Prevent us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, obtain everlasting life. And when the saints come marching in, may we be counted in their number. Thank you.
Amen. 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 Well done, Matt.
Hi, everyone. As Paige mentioned, I helped create the exhibit on the American Saints, which is upstairs. The work for this exhibit began almost exactly a year ago, actually, because after the University Students' Assembly with Father Caron, one of our friends came to the front and proposed to us that for the following year, we do a work of researching the American Saints and create an exhibit, and that in the summer, we travel to Italy, first to make a pilgrimage to Rome for the Year of Mercy, and then to present the exhibit at the meeting in Rimini. I immediately said yes, mostly because of the trip to Italy, but also because the proposal of the exhibit intrigued me. I didn't really know anything about American saints. I probably couldn't even have named one. And it was interesting to think that there were saints from my own homeland, that the history of the church had something to do with the history of the United States, which I learned about in grade school. So we divided the work by region, and my group, the Midwest, was assigned St. Catherine Drexel. I never heard of her. So when I Googled her, the first thing that came up with it was this black and white image of a serious-looking nun. And I was like, oh, great. This should be interesting. And so, I started to prepare myself for a very long year. However, I quickly looked at her Wikipedia page, and my curiosity was piqued because I found out that before becoming a religious, she had been an heiress to a huge fortune, and she gave up an extremely luxurious and wealthy lifestyle in order to travel across the country, educating some of the most of the country's most underserved populations, African Americans and Native Americans. And I found this interesting because, who does that? Who gives up this life that's so easy for a life that's really difficult and in service of others? So I was definitely more interested in Catherine at this point, but as I started to do more research and learn more about her life, I was still treating the work as sort of a history project. I thought Catherine had historical significance. She was interesting. She's probably a pretty good person. And that was kind of it. And I think that was kind of my conception of saints in general at the time. I thought a saint was just someone who embodied a certain virtue really well, and then they could sort of be like a distant role model for me, and this image of perfection that I could hold up against my own imperfection and then try to get better. And maybe that conception isn't necessarily wrong, but it was not satisfying when I was doing the work of Catherine Drexel, because I found a lot of incredible things that she did, but none of it really stayed with me. And it was almost like the work of this exhibit was just another class, in addition to the ones I was already taking. However, my approach was changed when we had our first meeting of those of us who were working on the exhibit at Benedictine College. And one of my friends said to me, right at the very beginning, that these saints we were researching had all been canonized in very recent times. And this is significant because it means that they have a relevance to us now. They have something to say to us today. And this conversation completely shifted my mindset. I no longer just wanted to collect interesting facts about this woman, but I was really asking the question, what does Catherine Drexel have to do with my life? And not only in a general sense, like how can her life still be an example to us today, but in a really personal sense. I had a desire to know if the particulars of Catherine's life could speak to the particulars of my own. I stopped wanting to know about a person, a historical figure, and I wanted to get to know a human, with desires, weaknesses, and a personality. And so with this approach, my perception of Catherine herself changed drastically. In reading her story, and especially in reading her own words, I saw Catherine was not a superhuman who accomplished amazing things by her own strength. Instead, her life was shaped not by her own ideas, but by an openness and a willingness to respond to the call of Jesus throughout her life. And I think this is made particularly clear in Catherine's vocation story, which I'll share a little bit of with you right now. So Catherine's family, while they were extremely wealthy, they were also very devout Catholics. And so even at a young age, Catherine was very strong in her Catholic faith. And when she was about 20, she began to sense that she had a vocation to the religious life. And she pictured herself living a life of contemplation and in prayer, totally dedicated to Jesus. And at the same time, her spiritual director was Bishop James O'Connor, who was the Bishop of Omaha, Nebraska, and he worked very closely with the Native American populations there. And she became very interested in the Native Americans and their plight and began wondering what she could do for them. So Catherine had these two desires in her heart that were very different. One for contemplation and a life of prayer, and then one to do something for these Native Americans. So with this internal struggle in her heart, her family took a trip to Rome, where they had a private audience with Pope Leo XIII, because that's the kind of stuff her family did. So when she was talking to him, she said, "Father, could you please send missionaries to help the Native Americans?" And I sort of read this as her way of saying, okay, look, I know these Native Americans need help, but I want to be a contemplative, so maybe he can send someone else to do it. But the Pope's response astonished her, because he replied, "Well, why not, my child? You yourself become a missionary." And in the face of this invitation, Catherine was, shocked and also felt very inadequate. The nature of this mission was huge and very expansive. However, with Bishop O'Connor's companionship, she continued to get to know the Native Americans around the country, as well as African American populations in the South. And she discovered that working with these people was indeed her calling. She went on to found and order the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and they opened over 50 schools and missions throughout the United States, including Xavier University in New Orleans. So when I read this, I was shocked to discover that her life as a missionary and as an educator was never part of her plan for her life. Instead, the shape of her life really began when she said yes to this completely unexpected invitation to mission from the Pope. The richness of her life was not due to her tenacity or self-assertion, but actually the opposite. It was born out of her receptivity to what was in front of her and what was asked of her. And this quality of responsiveness kept showing up again and again as I got to know Catherine more and more. I had the opportunity to interview a woman whose mother's life was completely changed by Catherine Drexel. Her mother, when she was a young girl, was an orphan living in Philadelphia, and she was sort of hopping around being taken care of by different religious orders of sisters. And the reason she had to keep being moved was because she was very naughty, and she would run away a lot from these orders. And so one of the orders who had her mother at the time, as sort of a last resort, decided to ask Catherine's order, the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, if they would take this girl in. And the mission in Philadelphia at the time was aimed towards African Americans, and this girl was not African American, but Sister Catherine Drexel made an exception and decided that they would take this girl in. And Catherine recognized almost immediately what the problem was with this girl. The problem was that she wanted an education. She wanted to learn. But these other orders who've been taking care of her were trying to train her to be a maid or to be a servant. So Catherine educated her, gave her an education, her behavior improved, and this woman went on to become a very successful nurse. Another example, in her work with Native Americans in the Southwest, Catherine gained the tribe's trust by asking them what they would prefer their children to learn in the schools the sisters were establishing, and then included trades such as blanket weaving or metallurgy in the curriculum. So you can see in both of these examples that Catherine's genius was not in her assertion of her own values or what she thought was right, but in her receptivity and responsiveness to the world in which she lived. As I got to know Catherine in this much realer way, a very incredible thing started to happen, which is that I began to feel accompanied by her. And not in an abstract way, you know, it's not that just that I was praying to her a lot, which I was, but in the sense that her life made me wonder if it was possible to look at my life in the way that she did. Her receptivity and obedience to the circumstances of her life provoked in me a desire to be more attentive to my own reality. And because of this, the daily tasks that I was doing this summer as I was doing this work took on a new intensity, whether that was taking care of the 9-year-old boy I babysat or writing papers for an online class, which is really amazing because normally in the summer I'm the opposite of intense, you know? But after discovering this kind of life that Catherine led, I couldn't help but be curious if my seemingly mundane circumstances held the same calling that Catherine could perceive in her circumstances. My relationship with Catherine grew so much throughout the summer that by the time it was time to present the exhibit in Rimini, and I think this was all of our experience working on the exhibit, we were really introducing people to our friends. They weren't just historical figures, but they were people who had had a bearing on our own life. Catherine continues to stay with me, even after returning from Italy. I thought of her a lot this past semester when I was volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club. She served as a reminder to be open to the desires of these kids instead of always trying to get them to do what I wanted to do. I'm now in my final semester of college, and in a time where I feel a lot of pressure to have my life all figured out and to have like a grand plan for my post-grad life, Catherine's life offers me a different possibility. Because of her witness, I desire so much more than just finding the perfect career. When Pope Francis visited the US in 2015, he mentioned Catherine's meeting with Pope Leo XIII and said that his question to her, and you, what are you going to do, is actually a question for all of us, because as Christians, by the virtue of our baptism, we too have received a mission. And so as I move beyond college, I pray that I have the receptivity and courage to respond to the mission to which I am being called. And thankfully, I'm not alone on this path, and I can always look to my friends, including St. Catherine Drexel, to help me along the way. Thank you.
What a great school. Well done.
This is the second year that we have had a New York Encounter School Contest, in which we invited the elementary school students of the Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of New York and the Diocese of Brooklyn to grapple with the theme of the encounter. This year, Reality Has Never Betrayed Me, through drawing a picture or writing an essay in response. And we have our two grand prize winners here today to receive recognition from Cardinal Dolan. And I think it's particularly fitting that we recognize these winners after this presentation on American saints, because the treasure of Catholic education desires to help form disciples, to participate in the salvific mission of the Church, and to form people that will grow up and grow in sanctity to join the company of the saints. So I'm delighted to recognize our two winners. The first in the category for grades 1 through 5 is Micah Gagarin.
Where's Mike?
He's a fifth grader at Resurrection Ascension Catholic Academy in the Diocese of Brooklyn. Before I recognize our next winner, I just wanted to share with you that the winners will receive a $1,000 tuition scholarship to be used at their Catholic schools. And this is thanks to the Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, in particular to President Stephen Minnis and to the Dean of the College, Kimberly Shankman, who sponsored this contest. And we are grateful for their friendship. So our next winner is an 8th grader at St. Mary Fishkill. Her name is Selena Santoro.
Very good.